The glass shattered before Elena Marchetti even understood what was happening. One moment she was arranging white roses in the front window of her flower shop, and the next moment a heavy fist of a man was standing on the other side of that window, staring at her through the cracked pane like she was something he owned. She dropped the roses. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were not. She had learned a long time ago that fear could live in her hands and never touch her face. The man did not smile. He simply turned and walked back to a black car waiting at the curb, the engine already running, as if breaking a window was nothing more than delivering a letter. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the spider web of cracks spreading across the glass her mother had installed with her own hands 15 years ago. Then she walked to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and called the only person she trusted enough to help her clean up a mess like this. Her cousin Margaret arrived 20 minutes later with a broom and a face full of worry. She did not ask questions right away. She simply started sweeping glass into a dustpan while Elena boarded up the broken window with a sheet of plywood from the storage room. It was only after the shop was dark and quiet, the plywood nailed into place, that Margaret finally spoke. "You need to tell someone about this," Margaret said. "This is not normal. This is not some random accident." Elena wiped her hands on her apron and looked around the shop that had been her mother's dream before it became her own. Every flower in this room had a story. Every vase had been chosen with care. This place was not just a business. It was the only thing left of the woman who raised her. "I know who did this," Elena said quietly. "I just do not know why they think they can get away with it." She had known, in truth, for almost 2 weeks. It started with a visit from a well-dressed man named Nathaniel Cole, who introduced himself as a representative of a property investment group. He had walked into her shop with a leather folder and an easy smile, offering to buy her building for a price that seemed almost too good to refuse. Elena had refused anyway. The shop was not for sale. It would never be for sale, not while she was breathing. Nathaniel had smiled even wider at her answer, the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. He told her to think it over. He said the offer would not stay open forever. Then he left a business card on her counter and walked out without another word. Elena had thrown the card away without a second thought. She did not know then that the card belonged to a company controlled by a man named Damien Cassano, a man whose name alone was enough to make grown business owners on that block empty their shops within a week of hearing it. She did not know that refusing his offer, however politely, was the beginning of something much larger than a business transaction. The next morning, Elena arrived at the shop to find her delivery truck had 2 flat tires. She called the tire shop she always used, only to be told, awkwardly and without much explanation, that they were too busy to help her that week. She called another shop across town, and they gave her the same answer. It took her 3 hours and twice the normal price to get someone willing to come out and fix the tires at all. She told herself it was bad luck. She wanted to believe that. Then, 4 days later, her main supplier for imported flowers called to cancel her weekly order without warning. The woman on the phone sounded nervous, almost apologetic, saying only that they could no longer service accounts in that part of the city. Elena pressed for a reason and got nothing but silence and a quick goodbye. It was Margaret who first said the word out loud. "Mafia," she whispered one evening, as if the word itself might summon trouble if spoken too loudly. "Elena, this is what they do. They squeeze you until you cannot breathe, and then they offer to save you from the very problem they created." Elena had laughed at first, because it sounded like something out of an old film, not something that could happen to a flower shop on a quiet street corner. But laughter faded fast once the health inspector showed up unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, going through her shop with a clipboard and a stern expression, looking for violations that did not exist. He found nothing wrong, because there was nothing wrong, but the visit left her rattled all the same. Someone had sent him. Someone wanted her to know they could reach into every part of her life whenever they pleased. That night, Alina sat alone in the back room of her shop, surrounded by buckets of unsold flowers slowly wilting because half her deliveries were being blocked. She thought about her mother, who had built this place out of nothing, working double shifts at a diner for years just to save enough money for the lease. Her mother used to say that a flower shop was not really about flowers. It was about giving people a place to feel something honest in a world that rarely allowed for softness. Weddings, funerals, apologies, celebrations, quiet Tuesday afternoons when someone needed a small piece of beauty to get through the day. Alina was not going to let that disappear because a stranger in an expensive suit wanted her corner of the block. She decided that night to fight back, though she did not yet know what fighting back would look like. The morning after the broken window, Alina opened the shop despite the boarded window, hanging a small hand-written sign that read open as usual, because closing felt like exactly what they wanted her to do. Her first customer of the day was an elderly woman named Charlotte, who came in every week to buy a single stem of lavender for her husband's grave. Charlotte noticed the plywood immediately and asked what happened. Alina hesitated, unsure how much to say, but something in Charlotte's steady gaze made her tell the truth. She explained the offer, the refusal, the flat tires, the canceled orders, the inspector, and now the broken glass. Charlotte listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with every new detail. When Alina finished, Charlotte set her lavender stem down on the counter and reached for Alina's hand. "My husband used to say that men like that only win when good people stay quiet," Charlotte said. "You are not the only person on this block who has dealt with someone from that man's circle. You would be surprised how many of us have a story." Alina blinked, unsure what to make of that. Charlotte squeezed her hand once more, paid for her lavender, and left without saying anything more. But the words stayed with Alina for the rest of the day, turning over and over in her mind like a stone she could not stop touching. That afternoon, a courier arrived with a folded note instead of flowers. Alina unfolded it carefully, half expecting another threat. Instead, it was an invitation, handwritten in careful cursive, requesting her presence at a private dinner that evening at an address across town. The note was signed with a single initial, D. Margaret, standing beside her, read the note over her shoulder and immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not," she said. "You are not walking into a private dinner with that man. Do you understand who you are dealing with?" "I understand exactly who I am dealing with," Alina said, folding the note back up. "That is why I am going." Margaret argued for nearly an hour, listing every reason why the idea was reckless, but Alina had already made up her mind. She was tired of being pushed around by threats delivered through other people. If Damien Cassano wanted to intimidate her, he could do it to her face. She would rather stand in front of him and see exactly what she was dealing with than spend another sleepless night imagining shadows. She arrived that evening at a restaurant that had clearly been rented out entirely for the occasion, empty except for a single table set near the back, candlelight flickering against dark wood walls. Damien was already seated when she walked in, dressed simply, none of the flash she expected from a man with his reputation. He stood when she approached, pulling out her chair like a man with manners, though his eyes carried none of the warmth his gesture suggested. "You broke my window," Alina said before she even sat down. There was no point pretending politeness when the truth was sitting right in front of her. Damien studied her for a long moment before responding. "That was not my order," he said finally, "but I will not pretend I am unaware of who did it." "Then you know exactly who to hold responsible," Alina replied, sitting down despite herself, unwilling to let him see how much her hands were shaking beneath the table. Damien poured 2 glasses of water, his movements unhurried, deliberate. "You are the first person on that block who has refused my offer twice," he said. "Most people take the money the first time it is presented to them. Some hesitate and take it the second time, once they understand what happens if they do not. And you thought breaking my window would help me understand faster," Alina said. I told you that was not my order, Damien repeated, his voice sharpening slightly. There are men in my organization who believe fear works faster than patience. I am beginning to disagree with them. Alina studied his face, searching for the cruelty she expected to find there, the kind of coldness that made grown men flee at the mention of his name. She found something else instead, something more complicated, a kind of tired calculation, as if he was constantly weighing costs and outcomes even in casual conversation. Why my shop, she asked. Out of everything on that block, why does a flower shop matter to a man like you? Because your corner sits exactly where a new development is planned, Damien said simply. Every other business owner on that street has already agreed to sell. You are the only obstacle left. Then find another corner, Alina said. There are 100 corners in this city. My mother built that shop with her bare hands. It is not for sale, and it will never be for sale, no matter how many windows you break or trucks you sabotage. Something flickered across Damien's face at that, something Alina could not quite name. He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way a man studies an opponent whose next move he cannot predict. You have 30 days, he said finally. After that, I cannot promise the people around me will continue to show restraint. Alina stood from the table without touching her water. Then I suggest you find a way to control the people around you, she said, because I am not going anywhere. She walked out of that restaurant with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she did not let it show, not until she was alone in her car 3 blocks away, gripping the steering wheel and finally allowing herself to shake. She had just looked the most dangerous man in the city directly in the eye and told him no. She did not know yet whether that decision would destroy her or save her, but she knew she could not have made any other choice and still looked at herself in the mirror the next morning. Driving home through empty streets, Alina thought about Charlotte's words from earlier that day. You would be surprised how many of us have a story. She thought about every woman she had ever helped through that shop, every bouquet delivered for a funeral, every wedding arrangement built from scratch, every small kindness exchanged over a counter covered in petals. She did not yet know how many of those women were connected to Damien's world in ways she could not imagine, women who had their own reasons to fear his name. Their own scars from his organizations reach into their lives. She parked outside her dark shop, staring at the boarded window through the windshield, and made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever came next, she was not going to face it alone. She just did not yet know how many hands would eventually reach out to hold hers when the fight truly began. She did not go inside right away. Instead, she sat in the car for a long while, watching the streetlight flicker above the empty sidewalk, replaying every word Damien had said. 30 days. It sounded so simple when he said it, as if it were nothing more than a deadline on an invoice, not a sentence hanging over everything her mother had built. Alina thought about calling the police, but she already knew how that conversation would go. A broken window with no witnesses. A canceled flower order with no signed confession. A flat tire that could be explained a dozen innocent ways. Men like Damien did not leave evidence behind. They left fear, and fear alone convinced no judge of anything. When she finally stepped out of the car, the night air felt colder than it should have for the season. She unlocked the shop door and stepped inside, flipping on a single lamp near the register rather than the harsh overhead lights. The scent of roses and lilies still clung to the air, soft and familiar, a small comfort in a day that had offered her almost none. She walked slowly between the buckets of flowers, touching petals here and there the way her mother used to do every night before closing, checking on each one like a mother checking on sleeping children. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Margaret, worried sick, demanding to know how the dinner had gone. Alina sat down on the small stool behind the counter and told her everything, word for word, watching her cousin's face grow more alarmed with every sentence through the video call. "30 days," Margaret repeated, her voice tight. "Alina, that man does not make idle threats. Everyone in this city knows what happens to people who do not listen to him." "I am not planning on doing nothing," Alina said. "I am planning on making it very difficult for him to win." Margaret pressed her about what that meant, but Alina did not have a full answer yet, only a feeling, a stubborn certainty settling into her chest that she was not the only person in this city who had a reason to stand against Damien Cassano and the men who worked beneath him. She thought again of Charlotte's words, spoken so simply over a single stem of lavender. "You would be surprised how many of us have a story." After the call ended, Alina stayed in the shop far longer than she should have, sweeping the floor that did not need sweeping, rearranging flowers that were already perfectly arranged, unwilling to go home to an empty apartment where the silence would only make her more afraid. She thought about her mother's old ledger, tucked away in a drawer beneath the register, filled with names of customers going back over a decade. Weddings, funerals, anniversaries, apologies bought with a single rose. Every name in that ledger represented a person whose life had touched this shop in some quiet way. She pulled the ledger out and opened it under the lamplight, running her finger down page after page of names written in her mother's careful handwriting. Somewhere in these pages, she thought, there might be more than customers. There might be allies. She did not yet know how right that thought would turn out to be, or how many of those names would soon step forward with stories of their own, stories about the very man who now wanted her corner of the street. Alina closed the ledger and held it against her chest for a long moment, the way she used to hold it as a child while her mother worked late into the evening arranging bouquets for the next day's deliveries. Tomorrow she would open the shop as usual, plywood window and all, and she would keep opening it every single day until either Damien gave up or she found a way to make him regret ever setting foot near her mother's dream. She switched off the lamp, locked the door behind her, and walked home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, unaware that the first thread of a much larger resistance had already begun to form, one name at a time, one story at a time, spreading quietly through a city that had grown tired of living in fear. The flowers were dead before Alina even opened the delivery box. Every single stem inside had wilted into brown ruin, as if they had been left in the summer heat for days instead of shipped overnight in a refrigerated truck. Alina stood in the back room of her shop, staring at the ruined roses meant for a wedding that afternoon, and felt something inside her chest go very still and very cold. This was not an accident. This was a message, delivered in the language Damien Cassano's people understood best. She called the bride immediately, her voice steady even though her hands were not, and promised she would find a solution before the ceremony began. Then she called every supplier she had ever worked with, one after another, only to receive the same nervous excuses she had heard weeks before. Too busy, out of stock, unable to service her account. By the fifth call, Alina understood clearly that this was not bad luck stacking up against her. Someone had made calls of their own, quietly warning every supplier in the city that doing business with her shop came with consequences. She finally found a small grower 2 hours outside the city willing to sell her enough flowers to save the wedding, though the price nearly emptied what remained of her savings. She drove there herself, loaded the flowers into her own car, and made it back with barely enough time to arrange them before the ceremony started. The bride never knew how close her wedding had come to falling apart. Alina preferred it that way. She was tired of being someone else's cautionary tale. That evening, exhausted and aching, Alina sat behind her counter documenting everything in a notebook she had started keeping since the night of the broken window. Dates, times, details, every canceled order, every strange visit, every subtle threat delivered by a man in a nice suit pretending to be a customer. She did not know yet what she would do with this information, but she knew instinct alone would not be enough to fight a man with Damien's resources. She needed proof. She needed patterns. She needed something more solid than fear. Margaret arrived just as Alina was closing the notebook, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she had news. "You are not going to believe who came to see me today," Margaret said, setting the coffee down on the counter. "Grace Whitfield. She owns the bakery 2 blocks from here." Alina knew Grace only in passing, a warm woman with flour permanently dusted across her apron, always kind whenever their paths crossed at the farmer's market. "What did she want?" Alina asked. "She wanted to know if the rumors were true," Margaret said, "that Damien's people have been targeting your shop. Apparently the same thing happened to her bakery last year, suppliers cutting her off overnight, a health inspector suddenly finding violations that never existed. She sold her building in the end because she could not afford to keep fighting alone." Alina felt her stomach tighten at the story, recognizing every detail as if it had been copied directly from her own life. "She is not the only one, is she?" Alina said quietly. Margaret shook her head slowly. "There is a whole list, apparently. A florist across town, a tailor, a woman who ran a small bookstore that closed last spring. Grace said everyone assumed it was just bad luck at the time because nobody talked about it openly. People were too scared." Alina sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. If Damien's organization had a pattern of pressuring small business owners into selling, then somewhere there had to be a paper trail connecting all these separate incidents: canceled contracts, suspicious inspection reports, property records showing suspiciously fast sales at suspiciously low prices. If she could find that pattern and expose it publicly, she might have a chance at making his tactics too visible to continue using safely. The following days brought no relief. A rumor began circulating that Alina's shop had failed a recent inspection, though no such inspection had actually taken place, and several regular customers stopped coming in, unsure what to believe. Someone slashed the tires on her delivery van a second time, this time in broad daylight, though no witnesses came forward when she asked around the block. Each incident chipped away at her resolve a little more, but each incident also strengthened her certainty that she could not fight this battle through official channels alone. The police in this city, she had learned from Margaret's careful research, rarely moved quickly against anyone connected to Damien's organization. It was Charlotte who returned first, stepping into the shop on a quiet afternoon with a folder tucked beneath her arm. She set it down on the counter without a word and waited for Alina to open it. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a short list of names, each one a woman who had crossed paths with Damien's organization in one way or another over the past several years. "I told you there were others," Charlotte said. "I spent the last week making some calls. These are just the women willing to talk. There are more who are still too frightened." Alina flipped through the folder slowly, reading names she did not recognize alongside a few she did. A nurse whose brother had been threatened after refusing to launder money through his small clinic. A teacher whose sister lost her restaurant to the same pressure tactics Alina was currently experiencing. A widow whose husband's construction business had been forced into bankruptcy after refusing to pay for protection he never asked for. Each story was different in its details but identical in its shape. A pattern of intimidation stretching across the entire city, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, because nobody had ever dared to compare notes out loud. "This is exactly what I needed," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charlotte, this could actually mean something." "It means nothing if we stay quiet about it," Charlotte said firmly. "I did not bring you this folder so you could hide it in a drawer. I brought it to you because I think you might be the person willing to finally do something with it." Over the next several days, word spread quietly through the neighborhood that Alina was collecting stories, and slowly, carefully, women began to appear at her shop after closing hours, when the street outside had emptied and nobody could see them slipping through her door. A hairdresser named Laura told her about equipment mysteriously vandalized after she refused to sell her salon. A young mother named Julia described men showing up at her husband's auto shop, speaking in low voices about accidents that could happen to careless drivers on dangerous roads. Every story added another piece to a growing picture, and Alina began to realize that her flower shop was no longer just a business trying to survive. It had quietly become a meeting place for a resistance that had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone brave enough or stubborn enough to bring it together. Not every visitor came with pure intentions. One evening, a woman named Vivian arrived at the shop claiming to have information about Damien's finances, only for Alina to later learn, through Margaret's cautious inquiries, that Vivian had connections to one of Damien's closest associates. Alina had shared nothing sensitive during that conversation, trusting her instincts enough to keep the details vague, but the encounter left her rattled, a clear reminder that Damien's reach extended further than she could always see. From that point on, she began meeting with women only after confirming their stories through at least one other trusted source, moving carefully, aware that a single misstep could put everyone involved in serious danger. Damien, meanwhile, was receiving reports of his own. Victor, his most trusted lieutenant, arrived at his office one evening with a face tight with irritation, laying a folder on the desk that mirrored, in a strange and unsettling way, the one Charlotte had brought to Alina weeks earlier. "She is talking to people," Victor said, "other business owners, women connected to families we have dealt with before. This is becoming a problem." Damien studied the folder without immediately opening it. "She is defending her shop," he said. "That is not a conspiracy. That is a woman refusing to be pushed around." Victor's jaw tightened. "With respect, this has gone beyond one shop. If these women start comparing notes publicly, sharing names, sharing dates, we could be looking at real exposure. Lawyers, journalists, people who might actually listen this time." Damien finally opened the folder, scanning the notes Victor had compiled, a list of names that overlapped uncomfortably with Charlotte's list, though neither man knew the other document existed. He said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable, the calculating stillness that had made him so feared for so many years now turned inward, weighing costs he had never before considered relevant. "Handle it quietly," Damien said finally. "No more broken windows, no more theatrics. I want this contained, not escalated." Victor did not look satisfied with that answer, but he nodded and left without further argument. Damien sat alone in his office long after his lieutenant departed, staring at Alina's name written near the top of the list, remembering the way she had looked at him across that restaurant table, refusing to flinch even as he laid out the full weight of what his organization could do to her life. He had meant every word of his warning that night. He had also, somewhere beneath the calculation, begun to respect her in a way he did not fully understand and did not particularly want to examine too closely. Back at the shop, Alina was unaware of the conversation taking place across the city, focused instead on the growing stack of stories filling her notebook, each new name a small spark of hope in what had otherwise felt like a lonely fight. Margaret suggested, half joking, that they should start calling it something, giving a name to whatever this quiet gathering of women was becoming. Alina laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, though the laughter faded quickly as she remembered the shattered windows still boarded up behind her, the flat tires, the dead flowers, the constant tension humming beneath every ordinary moment of her day. That night, walking home later than she meant to, Alina noticed a car idling across the street from her apartment, its headlights off, its engine running quietly in the dark. She did not recognize the vehicle, and she did not wait around to find out who was inside. She hurried up the stairs to her apartment, locked the door behind her, and stood with her back against it for several long minutes, her heart pounding, before finally allowing herself to breathe. She thought of Charlotte's folder, of Grace's bakery, of Laura's ruined equipment, of every woman who had trusted her with a story that could put them in danger simply for telling it. She thought of the 30-day deadline ticking steadily closer, and of the strange, unwanted flicker of something almost like respect she had seen in Damien's eyes across that restaurant table. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer just her fight. It belonged now to every woman whose name filled the pages of her notebook, and Alina understood, standing alone in the dark of her apartment, that there was no version of this story anymore where she simply walked away. The next morning, Alina woke early, unable to sleep past the first gray light filtering through her curtains. She made coffee she barely tasted and sat at her small kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, reading back through everything she had gathered so far. The stories were powerful on their own, but scattered across separate conversations, whispered in back rooms after closing hours, they carried no real weight. She needed a way to bring them together, something that could not be dismissed as rumor or gossip, something that would force people outside their small circle to pay attention. She thought of Grace's bakery again, and how the entire block had simply accepted its closing without ever questioning why a business that had thrived for a decade suddenly failed within a matter of months. She thought of the bookstore, the tailor shop, the florist across town, each one erased so quietly that most people barely noticed they were gone. That silence, she realized, was exactly what Damien's organization depended on. As long as every story stayed separate, isolated, easy to dismiss as one person's bad luck, nothing would ever change. The moment those stories connected, the moment 99 separate whispers became a single unified voice, the entire equation would shift. She arrived at the shop that morning determined to organize what she had gathered into something more permanent. She spent the slow hours between customers typing out summaries on an old laptop, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations, building a timeline that stretched back nearly 3 years. The pattern that emerged was undeniable once laid out clearly. Small business after small business, always along the path of new development projects, always experiencing the same combination of supply disruptions, false health violations, and quiet threats before eventually selling at a fraction of their worth. Margaret stopped by during her lunch break and found Alina hunched over the laptop, eyes red from staring at the screen too long. "You look like you have not slept in days," Margaret said, setting a paper bag of sandwiches on the counter. "I have not," Alina admitted, rubbing her eyes, "but look at this. Look at what we have." Margaret leaned over her shoulder, scanning the timeline Alina had built, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to astonishment. "This is not just a few unlucky business owners," Margaret said slowly. "This looks like an actual campaign." "That is exactly what it is," Alina said, "and I think Damien knows we are starting to see it too." As if summoned by the thought itself, the shop door chimed that same afternoon, and a delivery boy walked in carrying a single black envelope instead of flowers. Alina's stomach tightened as she accepted it, her fingers hesitating before she finally opened the seal. Inside was a short typed note, unsigned, warning her in careful, measured language that continuing to gather stories from other business owners would be considered a provocation rather than simple self-defense. There was no explicit threat in the wording, nothing that could be brought to any authority, but the meaning beneath the polite sentences was unmistakable. Alina read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside her notebook alongside everything else. Rather than frightening her into silence, the note only confirmed what she already suspected. She was close to something that mattered, close enough that someone in Damien's organization felt the need to respond directly instead of relying on quiet sabotage alone. That evening, she called Charlotte and asked her to spread word carefully among the women who had already come forward, letting them know that their stories were being organized into something concrete, something that could eventually be shown to journalists or lawyers willing to take the risk. Charlotte agreed without hesitation, though she cautioned Alina to be careful about who she trusted with the details, reminding her that not everyone offering help could be assumed safe. Alina closed the shop that night thinking not of fear, but of momentum. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt less like a woman standing alone against an empire, and more like the first thread in a net slowly being woven around men who had assumed, for years, that nobody would ever dare to connect the dots. The chanting outside Damien Cassano's front business started before the sun had fully risen, and by the time he arrived at his office that morning, the sidewalk was already lined with women holding handmade signs, their voices carrying clearly through the closed windows of his car. He sat frozen for a moment, staring through the tinted glass at a crowd larger than he had expected, larger than anything he had prepared for. Victor sat beside him, jaw clenched, already reaching for his phone to call in extra security. Alina stood near the front of the crowd, holding a sign that read "Our shops are not for sale," her voice steady as she led a chant that had spread through the neighborhood over the past several days like wildfire. Beside her stood Charlotte, Grace, Laura, Julia, and dozens of women whose names filled the pages of Alina's notebook. Women who had finally decided that silence had cost them enough. This was not the plan Alina had originally imagined when she first started collecting stories in her notebook. The plan had been quiet, careful, methodical, gathering evidence to eventually hand over to a journalist or a lawyer willing to take the risk of exposing Damien's organization. But 3 nights earlier, a group of the women had gathered in Alina's shop after hours, and the conversation had shifted from documentation to action, almost without anyone deciding it consciously. "We have been waiting for someone else to fix this for years," Grace had said that night, her flour-dusted apron replaced by a plain sweater, her voice tight with years of frustration. "Nobody is coming to save us. If we want this to stop, we have to make it impossible for them to ignore." The idea for the protest had grown from there, spreading through phone calls and quiet conversations at kitchen tables across the city, each woman reaching out to others she trusted, building a network far larger than Alina had ever imagined possible. By the morning of the protest, 99 women had committed to standing outside Damien's front business, a legitimate-looking company that served as the visible face of an organization built on fear. Inside the building, Damien paced his office while Victor argued for an immediate response. "We disperse this now," Victor said. "We cannot let this continue. Every minute those cameras roll, we lose more control." "There are cameras," Damien repeated flatly, moving to the window and looking down at the crowd below, at the local news van that had arrived only 20 minutes earlier, drawn by a tip that had come from somewhere within the crowd itself. "We should have handled her weeks ago," Victor said, his frustration finally breaking through his usual composed exterior. "This is what happens when we hesitate." Damien did not respond immediately. He watched Alina through the window, watched the way she stood at the front of the crowd without flinching, watched the way the other women rallied around her presence like she was some kind of anchor holding the entire demonstration together. He thought of their dinner weeks earlier, of the way she had looked at him without fear, even as he laid out exactly what his organization was capable of. He had underestimated her then. He was beginning to understand just how badly. "Get me a list of every reporter down there," Damien said finally, turning away from the window, "and find out who tipped off the news van. I want to know exactly how organized this is before we decide anything." Victor left to gather the information, clearly unsatisfied with the lack of immediate aggression, but Damien remained at the window a while longer, watching the crowd swell as more women arrived throughout the morning, some carrying signs, others simply standing in solidarity, their combined presence creating a wall of visibility that no amount of quiet intimidation could easily dismantle. Outside, a local reporter named Simon Hale approached Alina with a microphone, asking her directly about the accusations circulating regarding the company behind the building. Alina had rehearsed this moment carefully with Margaret the night before, choosing her words with precision, careful never to name Damien directly in a way that could expose her to legal retaliation, focusing instead on patterns, on documented incidents, on the shared experiences of dozens of small business owners across the city. "We are not here to accuse any one person of anything," Alina said clearly into the microphone, her voice carrying across the crowd. "We are here because too many of us have lost businesses, lost income, lost peace of mind because of the same pattern of intimidation, and we believe the public deserves to know that pattern exists." Simon Hale pressed further, asking if she had documentation to support these claims. Alina glanced briefly toward Charlotte, who gave a small nod of encouragement, before answering carefully that she and others had been compiling records for weeks, records they intended to share with any journalist or attorney willing to investigate properly. The interview would air on the evening news, reaching thousands of households across the city, planting a seed of public awareness that Damien's organization had never before been forced to confront so directly. Inside the organization, the reaction was immediate and fractured. Nathaniel Cole, the man who had first approached Alina with the buyout offer weeks earlier, arrived at Damien's office visibly rattled, worried that his own name might surface in connection with the pressure campaign, now being discussed openly on local television. Victor grew increasingly agitated as the day progressed, pushing harder for a response that Damien continued to resist, uncertain for the first time in years about the correct path forward. By evening, as the crowd outside finally began to disperse, Alina remained behind with a small group of women, exhausted but energized by what they had accomplished. Charlotte hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes, thanking her for finally giving voice to something so many of them had carried silently for years. Grace promised to help organize a second demonstration if the first failed to produce results. Laura and Julia exchanged numbers with several other women, building connections that would outlast whatever happened next in their fight against Damien's organization. Alina walked home that night feeling lighter than she had in weeks, though the weight of what still lay ahead pressed constantly at the edges of her relief. She knew Damien would not simply retreat because of one protest, no matter how large or how well covered by local news. Men like him did not surrender territory easily, and the 30-day deadline he had given her was still ticking steadily closer, now complicated by the public attention their demonstration had drawn. That night her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, half expecting another veiled threat, but the voice on the other end belonged to a young attorney named Edmund Hale, no relation to the reporter, who explained that he had seen the evening news broadcast and wanted to offer his services pro bono to any business owners willing to pursue legal action against the pattern of intimidation being described. Alina sat down slowly on her couch, gripping the phone tightly, feeling something shift inside her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor sat in a private meeting with two other members of Damien's inner circle, men whose names never appeared publicly but whose influence ran deep through the organization's operations. The conversation, held in low voices behind closed doors, focused not on Alina directly, but on damage control, on how to protect their own individual interests if the pressure campaign against small business owners ever became the subject of a genuine legal investigation. Trust, already fragile among men who had built careers on manipulation and self-interest, began to fracture in small, almost imperceptible ways that night, cracks that would only widen in the days ahead. Damien remained alone in his office long after everyone else had left the building, staring at a folder containing everything Victor had managed to gather about Alina's growing network. 99 names. 99 women who had decided together that they were no longer willing to stay silent. He thought of his own mother, long since passed, a woman who had worked tirelessly to build a small life for her family before his father's world pulled everything into darkness. He wondered, not for the first time since meeting Alina, what his mother would have thought of the empire he had built in the years since her passing. He closed the folder and sat in the darkness of his office for a long while, the sounds of the city drifting faintly through the closed window, the echo of chanting voices still somehow present in his mind hours after the crowd had dispersed. Whatever certainty had once defined his approach to running his organization felt increasingly unstable, cracked open by a florist who refused to back down and by 99 women who had proven, in a single afternoon, that fear was not as absolute a weapon as he had always believed it to be. The following morning brought a second wave of coverage, this time from a larger regional station that picked up the story after seeing clips from the previous evening's broadcast circulating online. Alina woke to find her phone flooded with messages, some from women she had never met asking how they could join the growing movement, others from local shop owners cautiously offering support now that the story had gained enough visibility to feel safer than silence. She sat at her kitchen table reading through message after message, overwhelmed by how quickly a single afternoon of standing outside a building had transformed into something so much larger than she had ever intended. Margaret arrived at the shop before opening hours, carrying a stack of printed articles she had gathered overnight, each one covering the protest from a slightly different angle. Some focused on the human stories behind the demonstration, highlighting Grace's lost bakery and Laura's vandalized salon. Others focused more cautiously on the unnamed company at the center of the accusations, careful not to state anything that could invite legal consequences, but clear enough in their implications that anyone familiar with the neighborhood understood exactly who was being discussed. "You have started something you cannot easily stop now," Margaret said, spreading the articles across the counter. "Do you understand that? This is not just your fight anymore. This belongs to the whole city now." Alina nodded slowly, feeling the truth of that statement settle heavily into her chest. "I know," she said. "I just hope it does more good than harm." That afternoon, Edmund Hale visited the shop in person, carrying a leather bag filled with legal notepads and a quiet, steady confidence that immediately put Alina at ease. He explained that he had spent years working on cases involving small business owners pressured out of their properties through illegal means, though he had rarely encountered a case with this much organized testimony behind it. He asked careful, methodical questions about the timeline Alina had built, cross-referencing dates and incidents with the same precision she had used herself while compiling the notebook. "This is remarkable work," Edmund said, flipping through her notes with evident respect. "Most people never bother documenting this carefully. If even half of these connections hold up under investigation, you could be looking at grounds for a serious civil case, possibly criminal charges depending on what surfaces during discovery." Alina felt a cautious flicker of hope at his words, tempered immediately by the memory of the black envelope still tucked inside her notebook, the quiet warning that had arrived days earlier reminding her exactly how far Damien's organization was willing to go to protect itself. She explained the note to Edmund, who read it carefully before setting it aside with a grave expression. "This confirms exactly what I suspected," he said. "They are worried. Men who are not worried do not bother sending warnings. We need to move carefully from here, protecting every woman who has come forward, making sure nothing traces back to put any of them in danger before we are ready to act publicly through proper legal channels." Over the following days, Edmund began meeting privately with several of the women who had contributed stories to Alina's notebook, taking sworn statements, gathering documentation of financial losses, building a case file that grew thicker with each passing conversation. Charlotte brought forward records from her late husband's construction business. Grace located old bank statements showing the sudden, unexplained cancellation of her bakery's supply contracts. Laura provided photographs of her vandalized salon equipment, time-stamped and dated in ways that matched suspiciously with the timeline of her refusal to sell. Word of the growing case spread carefully through trusted channels, reaching women Alina had never personally met, women who had suffered similar fates in parts of the city far removed from her own neighborhood. A seamstress named Eliza came forward, with stories of harassment stretching back nearly 5 years. A young widow named Clara described threats made against her late husband's restaurant before it eventually closed under mysterious circumstances. Each new story added weight to the growing case, transforming what had once felt like an isolated personal struggle into unmistakable evidence of a citywide pattern. Not everyone who approached Alina, however, came with pure intentions. A well-dressed woman claiming to represent a legal advocacy group visited the shop one afternoon, asking detailed questions about Edmund's involvement and the specific names of women who had already given statements. Alina, wary after her earlier encounter with Vivian, answered carefully and vaguely, offering nothing concrete until she could verify the woman's credentials. When Edmund later confirmed that no such advocacy group existed under the name the woman had provided, a cold understanding settled over both of them. Damien's organization was not simply reacting defensively anymore. They were actively probing for weaknesses, searching for a way to identify and silence the case before it could gain enough momentum to become truly dangerous. Alina tightened her precautions after that encounter, meeting only with women vouched for by someone she already trusted, keeping the growing case file locked in a secure location away from the shop itself. The tension of those days wore on everyone involved, but the momentum they had built refused to slow, each new testimony strengthening their position even as the risks around them continued to grow. By the end of the week, Edmund estimated that he had gathered sworn statements from over 30 women, with dozens more expressing willingness to come forward once they felt confident enough in the safety of the process. It was, he told Alina during a quiet evening meeting in her shop, one of the strongest patterns of coordinated intimidation he had encountered in his entire career. A case with the potential to expose not just Damien Cassano, but the network of associates who had helped him maintain control over so many corners of the city for so many years without ever facing real consequences. Alina listened to his assessment with a mixture of pride and fear, aware that every step forward brought them closer to a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. She thought of the 30-day deadline, now less than 2 weeks away, and wondered how Damien would respond once he understood the full scale of what was being built against him, quietly and carefully, one sworn statement at a time. The car came to a sudden stop just inches from the front door of Alina's shop, tires screeching against the pavement loud enough to bring Margaret running from the back room, her face pale with alarm. Alina stood frozen behind the counter, watching through the newly repaired window as 2 men stepped out of the vehicle, their expressions carrying none of the polite restraint that had characterized earlier visits from Damien's organization. This was different. This felt like the moment Charlotte had warned her about weeks earlier, the moment when careful pressure gave way to something far more dangerous. Before either man reached the door, however, 3 women appeared on the sidewalk, seemingly from nowhere, forming a loose but deliberate line between the men and the shop entrance. Grace stood at the center, her arms crossed, her expression unyielding despite the obvious tension radiating from the 2 strangers approaching her. Within moments, more women emerged from nearby shops and apartments, drawn by a phone chain Alina had established days earlier specifically for moments like this one. The men hesitated, clearly unprepared for the sight of a growing crowd forming so quickly around a target that had been expected to remain isolated and vulnerable. One of them exchanged a quiet word with the other before both retreated back to their car, driving away without ever setting foot inside the shop. Alina exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, watching through the window as Grace and the other women remained in place a while longer, ensuring the car was truly gone before finally dispersing. This was the direct result of a decision Alina had made only 3 days earlier, after Edmund warned her that the growing legal case might provoke a more aggressive response from Damien's organization. Rather than waiting passively for danger to arrive, Alina had organized a rapid response network among the women who had joined her cause, a simple system of phone calls that could summon a protective presence to any location within minutes. It was Charlotte's idea originally, drawn from her late husband's experience organizing neighborhood watch groups decades earlier, adapted now for a very different kind of threat. Inside the organization, the failed attempt at intimidation triggered exactly the kind of fracture Damien had feared since the protest weeks earlier. Victor arrived at his office that evening furious, blaming the failure on poor planning by the two men he had sent, though Damien suspected the deeper issue ran far beyond simple logistics. They could not even approach the building without a crowd forming within minutes, Victor said, pacing the length of the office. This woman has built something we do not fully understand. We need to consider more permanent solutions before this spirals further out of control. Damien's expression darkened at the suggestion, though he said nothing immediately, staring instead at the growing folder Victor had compiled over the past several weeks, thick now with names, addresses, and photographs of women connected to Alina's network. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Damien finally asked, his voice carrying a warning edge that Victor either failed to notice or chose to ignore. "I am suggesting we stop treating this like a business dispute," Victor said. "Every day we hesitate, more women join her cause, more evidence accumulates, more attention gathers around operations that have taken years to build carefully out of public view. If this continues, we lose everything, not just this one corner of the city." Damien stood slowly from his desk, crossing the room to stand directly in front of his longtime lieutenant, a man who had served alongside him since the earliest days of building this organization. "You're talking about harming civilians," Damien said quietly. "Women with no connection to organized operations, women who simply refuse to be bullied out of businesses they built with their own hands. That is not the organization my father built, and it is not the organization I intend to run." Victor's jaw tightened at the mention of Damien's father, a subject rarely discussed openly between them. "Your father built an empire through discipline and consequence," Victor said. "He never let sentiment interfere with necessary decisions. I begin to wonder if this florist has clouded your judgment in ways you do not fully recognize." The accusation hung heavy in the air between them, neither man willing to back down, until Damien finally turned away, dismissing Victor with a curt gesture that left no room for further argument. But the conversation lingered with him long after Victor departed, a growing awareness that his own organization, the very structure he had spent years reinforcing, now contained voices willing to escalate toward violence against people who had done nothing more than refuse to be silenced. That same week, cracks within Damien's inner circle widened further when Nathaniel Cole, panicked by the growing legal case Edmund had assembled, made a decision that would prove disastrous for the entire organization. Desperate to protect himself from potential prosecution, Nathaniel quietly reached out to a contact within the local prosecutor's office, offering information about the pressure campaign in exchange for immunity from whatever charges might eventually be filed. He did not inform Damien or Victor of this decision, choosing instead to protect his own interests first, a betrayal that would not remain hidden for long within an organization built on the constant, careful monitoring of everyone inside it. Victor discovered the betrayal within days, his network of informants alerting him to Nathaniel's secretive meeting with a prosecutor's assistant at a quiet restaurant across town. The discovery sent a fresh wave of paranoia rippling through the organization's upper ranks, as men who had once trusted each other implicitly began questioning who else might be preparing to abandon ship if the legal pressure continued mounting. Old grudges resurfaced. Whispered accusations spread through private conversations. The unity that had once made Damien's organization so formidable began fracturing from within, exactly as Alina and her growing network had hoped it eventually would, though none of them yet knew how deeply the damage was spreading. Alina, unaware of the turmoil unfolding within Damien's ranks, spent those days focused on strengthening her own network, meeting regularly with Edmund to review the growing case file, coordinating with Charlotte and Grace to expand the rapid response system that had already proven its worth once. She felt the weight of the approaching deadline pressing constantly against her thoughts, aware that whatever final confrontation awaited her would likely arrive soon, though she could not have predicted exactly how it would unfold. The confrontation came on a quiet evening nearly a week later, when Victor, increasingly desperate to reassert control over a situation spiraling beyond his ability to manage, made the decision to act without waiting for Damien's explicit approval. He sent 2 men to Alina's apartment rather than her shop, believing correctly that fewer witnesses would be present at that hour, unaware that Alina's rapid response network extended beyond her business hours into her personal life as well, thanks to a suggestion Charlotte had made only days earlier. The 2 men arrived to find Margaret already waiting outside the building, having received a warning call from a neighbor who recognized one of the men from an earlier encounter near the shop. Within minutes, a small group of women had gathered on the sidewalk outside Alina's apartment building, enough of a presence to make the 2 men reconsider whatever plan Victor had given them. They left without incident, but the attempt itself represented a dangerous escalation that Alina could no longer ignore. She called Damien directly that night, using a number Charlotte had obtained through a contact within the organization weeks earlier, a number Alina had kept in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. Damien answered on the second ring, his voice carrying genuine surprise at hearing her voice rather than expecting it. "Your men came to my apartment tonight," Alina said, her voice steady despite the fear still coursing through her body. "I do not know if that was your order, but I need to know whether you are still capable of controlling the organization you claim to run." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Damien finally answered. "That was not my order," he said, and something in his voice carried a weight of genuine anger that Alina had not expected to hear. "Give me an hour. This will not happen again." True to his word, Damien arrived at Victor's apartment within the hour, the confrontation between the 2 men escalating into the most severe conflict their long partnership had ever experienced. Victor argued desperately that his actions had been necessary, that Damien's hesitation was going to destroy everything they had built together. That sentiment had no place in an organization built on discipline and control. Damien listened to every argument without interruption, his expression growing colder with each passing sentence, until finally he spoke with a quiet finality that left no room for further debate. "You will not touch her again," Damien said. "You will not touch any of the women connected to her. If you cannot accept that condition, then you no longer have a place in this organization." Victor stared at him in disbelief, searching his old friend's face for any sign of hesitation, finding none. "This is not the man your father raised," Victor said finally, his voice thick with bitterness. "You are choosing a stranger over everything we have built together." "I am choosing not to become the kind of man who harms people simply because they refuse to be afraid," Damien said. "That choice was always mine to make, and I am making it now." The following morning, Alina received an unexpected visit at her shop, not from another threatening stranger, but from Damien himself, arriving alone, without the usual entourage of men who typically surrounded him during public appearances. Margaret stiffened immediately at the sight of him, but Alina raised a hand, signaling her cousin to remain calm as Damien stepped through the door. "I came to tell you personally that the man responsible for last night will no longer be part of my organization," Damien said, his voice carrying none of the calculated coldness from their first dinner together weeks earlier. "And I came to ask you something I never expected to find myself asking." "What is that?" Alina asked, her guard still raised despite the unexpected sincerity in his tone. "I want to know what it would take to end this the right way," Damien said. "Not through pressure, not through fear, but through some kind of resolution that lets you keep what your mother built, and lets me walk away from an empire that has clearly cost more than I ever allowed myself to recognize." Alina studied him carefully, searching his face for the manipulation she still half expected to find there, but found instead something that looked remarkably like exhaustion, the weight of a man beginning to question everything he had built his life around. She did not answer immediately, aware that whatever she said next would shape everything that followed, not just for herself, but for every woman whose story now filled the growing case file sitting safely in Edmund's office across town. Finally, she stepped out from behind the counter and gestured toward the small seating area near the window, the same window that had once been shattered on Damien's order weeks earlier, now fully repaired with fresh glass that caught the morning light. "Sit down," she said. "If you want a real answer, this is going to take longer than a doorway conversation." Damien sat, visibly uncertain in a way that felt strange for a man used to commanding every room he entered. Margaret remained near the counter, watching closely, though she said nothing, trusting Alina's judgment even as her own instincts screamed caution. "It is not enough to simply walk away quietly," Alina said. "Grace lost her bakery. Laura's salon was vandalized twice. A widow lost her husband's restaurant because your organization decided her grief made her an easy target. If you truly want this to end the right way, it starts with making those women whole again, not just protecting me because I happen to be the one who refused loudly enough to be noticed." Damien absorbed her words without argument, nodding slowly. "I can return the properties that were taken through the shell companies my organization controlled," he said. "It will take time, and it will not undo everything that was lost, but it is something concrete I can actually do." "It is a start," Alina said, "but it cannot stop there. The women who came forward need to know they are safe permanently, not just for as long as it remains convenient for you. And the case Edmund has built deserves to see daylight, not disappear quietly because you decided to change your mind." Damien's expression tightened slightly at the mention of the legal case, the old instinct toward self-preservation flickering briefly across his face before fading again. "You are asking me to expose my own organization," he said, "to hand over the very people who built this alongside me. I am asking you to decide whether you are the man your father raised, or something else entirely," Alina said, echoing without realizing it the very words Victor had thrown at him only hours earlier. "You already made that choice once last night when you chose me over Victor. This is simply the next version of that same choice." The silence between them stretched long, filled only by the quiet hum of the shop's small refrigeration unit keeping the flowers fresh. Finally, Damien nodded once slowly, as if settling something deep within himself that had been unsettled for years. "I will need protection of my own once this becomes public," he said. "Men like Victor do not simply walk away quietly when their entire livelihood collapses around them." "That is something we can figure out together," Alina said, surprising herself with the word together, unsure until she spoke it exactly how far she was willing to extend trust toward a man who had threatened her very existence only weeks before. "But it will only work if you are honest, completely honest, with Edmund and with every woman whose life your organization touched." Damien stood slowly, extending a hand toward her, an oddly formal gesture given everything that had passed between them. "I will call your attorney this afternoon," he said, "and I will bring whatever records exist proving the properties were taken unfairly." Alina shook his hand, feeling the strange, unfamiliar shift of an enemy becoming something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. As he turned to leave, she called after him one final question that had lingered in her mind since their very first conversation weeks earlier. "Why now?" she asked. "What actually changed your mind?" Damien paused at the door, considering the question carefully before answering. "You did," he said simply. "And 99 women who refused to disappear quietly, the way everyone before you always did." He left the shop without another word, leaving Alina standing amid the flowers her mother had once tended with such careful devotion, uncertain whether she had just witnessed the beginning of something remarkable or the opening move of a far more dangerous game. Margaret crossed the room slowly and stood beside her, watching through the newly repaired window as Damien's car pulled away from the curb. "Do you trust him?" Margaret asked quietly. Alina considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Not yet," she said, "but I trust what 99 women built together more than I trust any promise from a single man, and that is enough to move forward carefully." Gunfire never came, but betrayal did, and it arrived at Edmund's office in the form of a masked man who broke through the back entrance at midnight, searching frantically through file cabinets for the case documents that had taken weeks to compile. Edmund, working late that night, heard the noise from his private office and had just enough time to trigger a silent alarm before the intruder fled empty-handed, unaware that Edmund had already moved the most sensitive files to a secure digital backup days earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate attempt. Alina received the call from Edmund before dawn, her heart pounding as she listened to him describe the break-in, relieved but shaken that the case remained intact. "This was Victor's doing," Edmund said grimly. "He is not going quietly, and I suspect he knows exactly how much danger he is in now that Damien has turned against him." Victor had indeed spent the days since his removal from Damien's organization growing increasingly desperate, watching his former partner methodically dismantle the very empire they had built together over so many years. Damien had already begun returning properties to the business owners who had been forced out through years of quiet intimidation, working closely with Edmund to identify every shell company connected to the illegal pressure campaign. Grace received the deed to her old bakery building within days, tears streaming down her face as she stood once again in the empty space that had once housed her life's work. Laura's salon equipment was replaced entirely, funded quietly through Damien's own resources rather than any official settlement that might have drawn unwanted attention before the timing was right. But Victor, cornered and increasingly unstable, was not finished. He gathered what remained of his loyal associates within the organization, men who feared prosecution more than they feared Damien's authority, and began planning one final attempt to destroy the case before it could be filed formally with the district attorney's office. The break-in at Edmund's office had been his first move. When it failed, Victor turned his attention toward a more direct target, believing correctly that removing Alina from the equation entirely might still be enough to unravel the fragile coalition of women who had built their case around her leadership. Charlotte was the one who noticed the unfamiliar car parked outside the shop for the third consecutive day, its presence too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. She alerted Alina immediately, and within the hour, Damien himself arrived at the shop, his expression grave as he confirmed what Alina had already begun to suspect. "Victor is planning something," Damien said. "My sources tell me he has grown desperate enough to consider options he would never have entertained even a month ago. I need you to trust me on this. Close the shop for a few days. Let me handle this the right way, without more violence, without giving him an opening he can exploit." Alina hesitated, unwilling after everything to simply retreat behind closed doors while others fought battles on her behalf. But the memory of the men who had once broken her window, the two strangers who had approached her shop weeks earlier, the men sent to her own apartment, all of it settled heavy in her chest, reminding her that caution was not the same as weakness. She agreed, closing the shop for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, though she refused to disappear entirely, instead spending those days working alongside Edmund from a secure location, finalizing the legal case that had grown to include testimony from over 60 women across the city. Damien, meanwhile, worked quietly through his remaining contacts within the organization, isolating Victor from the resources and manpower he would need to carry out whatever plan he had been developing. The confrontation, when it finally came, unfolded not through violence but through exposure. Nathaniel Cole, still desperate to protect himself from prosecution after his earlier betrayal, agreed to provide detailed testimony against Victor specifically, describing in careful detail the meetings where Victor had ordered the harassment campaign against Alina and the other business owners. Combined with the sworn statements Edmund had already gathered, the evidence against Victor grew undeniable, strong enough that local prosecutors finally agreed to move forward with formal charges, an outcome that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Victor was arrested quietly on a Tuesday morning, without the dramatic confrontation he had perhaps imagined for himself, taken into custody at his own apartment before he ever had the chance to carry out whatever final plan he had been developing against Alina. The news spread quickly through the network of women who had built their case so carefully over the preceding weeks, each one receiving the news with a mixture of relief and disbelief that the man who had orchestrated so much of their suffering was finally facing real consequences. Alina reopened her shop the following week, standing once again behind the counter where her mother had spent so many years building something lasting out of nothing more than careful devotion and stubborn hope. The window that had once been shattered now let in soft morning light across fresh arrangements of roses and lilies, and for the first time in months, Alina felt something close to peace settling into the familiar rhythm of her days. The legal case against Damien's former organization proceeded carefully over the following weeks, with Damien himself providing extensive cooperation, a decision that drew significant public attention once local news outlets connected the pieces of a story that had begun with a single protest outside a downtown building. Some criticized the deal that allowed Damien to avoid the harshest possible consequences in exchange for his cooperation, but Alina understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the choice he had made in those final weeks had prevented far greater harm than any court sentence could have addressed after the fact. 99 women, and dozens more who joined afterward, were formally recognized in a ceremony held at the very corner where Alina's shop still stood, a gathering organized by Grace and Charlotte to honor everyone who had contributed to dismantling a pattern of intimidation that had haunted the city for years without anyone ever daring to speak against it collectively. Local officials attended, along with reporters from stations across the region, though Alina found herself uninterested in the cameras, focused instead on the faces of women who had trusted her with their stories when trusting anyone felt like an impossible risk. Grace's bakery reopened fully restored, its ovens once again filling the block with the scent of fresh bread each morning. Laura's salon thrived with new equipment and a steady stream of customers who had heard her story and wanted to support her recovery. The widow who had lost her husband's restaurant received compensation that allowed her to finally consider rebuilding, though she admitted to Alina during the ceremony that some losses could never be fully repaired, only honored through the changes that followed them. Damien attended the ceremony as well, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd rather than at its center, no longer the feared figure whose name alone had once emptied businesses along that block. He had begun, in the weeks since Victor's arrest, working alongside Edmund on a foundation designed to support small business owners recovering from exactly the kind of predatory pressure his organization had once inflicted, a quiet penance that Alina suspected would take years to feel like enough, if it ever truly could. After the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, Damien approached Alina near the entrance of her shop, where the very window that had once been shattered now stood whole and bright in the afternoon sun. "I never expected any of this when I first sent Nathaniel to make you an offer," Damien said. I thought I understood exactly how the world worked, exactly what people would do when pressured hard enough. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered. Alina studied him for a long moment, remembering the man who had once sat across from her in a rented restaurant, calmly explaining the 30 days she had left before her life fell apart. That man felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone still uncertain of his place in a world he had spent so long trying to control through fear alone. "You are not entirely wrong," Alina said. "Pressure does work sometimes. It just does not always break the direction people expect it to. You pressured one flower shop, and it grew into something large enough to break the very organization built to apply that pressure in the first place." Damien allowed himself something close to a genuine smile, rare and unguarded in a way Alina had never witnessed from him before. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Alina said, gesturing toward the shop behind her, filled with flowers arranged with the same careful devotion her mother had taught her so many years earlier, "I keep doing exactly what I was always doing. Building something honest, one flower at a time, and trusting that the people around me will keep choosing to stand together when it matters most." She turned to walk back inside, pausing only briefly at the doorway to look back at him one final time. "And you," she said, "figure out who you want to become now that fear is no longer the only tool available to you. That part is entirely up to you." She stepped inside and returned to her work, arranging a fresh bouquet for a customer waiting patiently at the counter, the late afternoon light spilling warmly through the window that had once been broken and was now, finally, whole. Outside, the corner that had nearly become the site of her downfall stood instead as proof of something far stronger than fear had ever managed to build, a testament to 99 women who had refused to disappear quietly, and to a flower shop that had somehow, against every expectation, changed the shape of an entire city. In the months that followed, the shop became something more than it had ever been before, a quiet gathering place for the network of women who had built their resistance together. Charlotte began stopping by every Friday afternoon, no longer only for a single stem of lavender, but to help Alina plan small workshops for other business owners who wanted to learn how to document harassment, how to organize quickly, how to protect themselves before trouble ever reached their doorstep. Grace brought fresh bread from her restored bakery to share during those gatherings, insisting that no serious planning could happen on an empty stomach, a small joke that always drew laughter from the room. Edmund continued his work long after Victor's case concluded, using the momentum built by Alina's network to take on new clients across the city, small business owners, who had suffered under similar patterns of intimidation from other corners of the criminal world. He often credited Alina's meticulous notebook as the model he now recommended to every new client, a simple habit of writing down dates and details that had ultimately proven powerful enough to dismantle an operation many had assumed untouchable. Laura's salon became a training ground of sorts as well, where she taught other stylists in the neighborhood how to spot the early signs of the same sabotage she had once endured: canceled supply orders, sudden equipment damage, unexplained visits from officials who found nothing wrong but left anyway with a lingering sense of unease. The widow who had lost her husband's restaurant eventually opened a smaller cafe 2 streets over, dedicating its opening menu to the recipes he had once served, a quiet act of memory that the whole neighborhood turned out to support on its first morning. Damien's foundation grew slowly but steadily, funding legal assistance for business owners across the city who found themselves facing threats similar to what Alina had once endured alone. He visited the shop occasionally, always briefly, always careful not to overstay whatever fragile trust had grown between them, though Alina noticed over time that his visits felt less like obligation and more like something he genuinely looked forward to. They spoke of ordinary things during those visits: the changing seasons, the price of imported flowers, the slow rhythms of a neighborhood healing from years of quiet fear. Conversations that would have seemed impossible on the night he first threatened to close her mother's shop. One late afternoon, nearly a year after the ceremony, Alina stood in the doorway of her shop watching the street outside, busy now with customers moving freely between the bakery, the salon, and the small cafe down the block, none of them aware of how close this entire corner had once come to disappearing beneath the weight of a single man's ambition. She thought of her mother often in these quiet moments, wondering what she would have made of everything that followed her passing, the danger, the fear, and ultimately the strange, unexpected community that had grown from a single broken window. She believed, standing there with the scent of fresh roses drifting around her, that her mother would have understood completely. The shop had never truly been about flowers. It had always been about giving people a place to feel something honest, a place worth protecting no matter what stood against it. And in the end, that simple truth had proven stronger than every threat a criminal empire had ever managed to throw against it.